My name is Sarah. I used to be their daughter, until I became their afterthought. I remember the room going quiet the day they read the will. Not the kind of quiet that comes with grief, but the uncomfortable silence that settles when people are eager to move past formalities. My sister Rebecca sat in the front row, her back straight, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for an appointment she already knew the outcome of. I stood near the wall, close enough to hear but far enough away that I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The lawyer's voice was steady, professional. To my daughter Rebecca, I leave the family home on Maple Street, the savings account, and all household items and heirlooms. My sister nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She'd known. Of course she'd known. I waited for my name. The lawyer continued reading. Small gifts to distant relatives, donations to charity. And then he closed the folder. That was it. No mention of Sarah. No mention of me. The room exhaled collectively, as if everyone had been holding their breath for a disaster that never came. My mother's eyes met mine for a split second before she looked away. My aunt shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but said nothing. Rebecca was already discussing logistics with the lawyer, when she could take possession, what paperwork needed to be filed. I might as well have been invisible. The betrayal wasn't just in what they didn't give me. It was in how easily they all accepted it. No one questioned it. No one looked surprised. It was as if my exclusion had been discussed, decided, and filed away long before my father took his last breath. I was the quiet one, the one who'd moved away for college and never quite moved back. To them, that was abandonment. To me, it had been survival. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes the loneliest moments connect us to people we never expected to understand. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of whispered conversations I wasn't part of. I heard fragments. How Rebecca was finally stepping up. How she was doing right by the family. They spoke about her like she was some kind of hero, taking on the burden of our father's legacy. Meanwhile, I was the ghost who drifted away, the ungrateful daughter who couldn't be bothered to call every Sunday. I wanted to scream that I'd called, that I'd tried, that every conversation with my father had felt like walking through a minefield, never knowing which topic would trigger his disappointment in me. But screaming would have required someone to listen, and I'd learned long ago that my voice didn't carry much weight in this family. So I moved back to the city, to my small apartment with its view of the fire escape and the sounds of other people's lives drifting through thin walls. I told myself it wasn't retreat. It was preservation. I had work to do, a life to rebuild, a sense of self to recover from the wreckage of their dismissal. The memories came in waves during those long nights. Rebecca's graduation party, where I'd watched from the kitchen as our parents beamed with pride, telling anyone who'd listen about their successful daughter. My own graduation had been a quiet affair. Dinner at a chain restaurant, conversation that felt obligatory. When I'd gotten my first promotion, my mother's response had been, "That's nice, dear. Rebecca just got engaged." Everything I did was measured against Rebecca's achievements. Every choice I made was questioned, every absence exaggerated. When I didn't come home for Easter one year, because I was working on a critical project, it became the story of how I'd chosen work over family. When Rebecca missed Christmas because she was vacationing in Europe, it was an adventure everyone wanted to hear about. But I had built something in the silence, something they couldn't see or touch or dismiss. I had friends who valued my opinion, colleagues who respected my work, a small circle of people who saw me as I truly was, not as Rebecca's less impressive sister. I had cultivated quiet strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but holds steady when everything else falls apart. I worked late most nights, partly because I loved what I did, and partly because going home to an empty apartment felt easier than facing the hollow space where family support should have been. My boss, Margaret, noticed the extra hours and the quality of my work. "You've got something special," she told me one evening as we reviewed a project I'd spent weeks perfecting. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." If only she knew how much I needed to hear that. 3 months after the funeral, I received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was professional, unfamiliar. "Ms. Sarah Mitchell? This is David Hartwell from Hartwell & Associates. I was your father's attorney for certain private matters. I believe we need to meet." My heart skipped. I thought James Peterson handled my father's estate. "Mr. Peterson, handled the primary estate, yes, but there are additional matters to discuss. Would you be available to meet this week?" I sat in the coffee shop where we'd arranged to meet, watching the door and wondering what other secrets my father had kept. David Hartwell was a small man with kind eyes and careful hands that handled documents like they contained fragile truths. "Your father came to see me about 5 years ago," he began, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "He was concerned about certain family dynamics. He wanted to ensure that some things were handled separately from his main estate." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in my father's careful handwriting, and beneath it, legal documents I didn't understand. "My dear Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've probably discovered that the family believes they've inherited everything. They haven't. Years ago, when you were just starting college, I began setting aside certain assets in a private trust. Properties, investments, royalties from patents I developed early in my career. Things they never knew about because they never asked about my work. You are the quiet observer, the one who watches and remembers. You were the one who listened. When I talked about my projects, even when you didn't understand them, you never asked for anything, never demanded attention, never made me feel like my value was measured only in what I could provide. Rebecca will do well with the house and the savings. She knows how to manage practical things, how to make others feel comfortable with her choices. But you understand the weight of silence, the power of being overlooked. The trust I've established is for you alone. Use it wisely, use it quietly, and know that you were seen." I read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. Mr. Hartwell watched patiently as tears I'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. "The trust contains significant assets," he explained gently. "Properties in 2 states, a portfolio of investments, and ongoing royalties from your father's early patent work. The annual income alone exceeds what most people see in several years." I stared at the documents, trying to process what this meant. My father, who had seemed so distant, who had participated in my gradual erasure from family importance, had secretly ensured I would be cared for. Not just cared for, empowered. "Why didn't he tell me?" I whispered. "He wanted to see how you would handle being overlooked. He said you had a strength that didn't need recognition to thrive, and he wanted to be sure you'd develop that strength fully before you knew about this inheritance." The irony was overwhelming. While my family had been dividing up what they thought was everything, celebrating Rebecca's good fortune and my apparent misfortune, I had become the recipient of a legacy they couldn't imagine. I spent the next several weeks learning about investments I now owned, properties that generated income I'd never expected, and royalty payments that arrived monthly like clockwork. My father had been far wealthier than any of us had known, and he'd hidden the bulk of it in a trust designed to activate only after his death. The knowledge changed everything, and nothing. I still woke up in the same apartment, still went to the same job, still carried the same ache from my family's rejection, but underneath it all was a new foundation, not just financial security, but the profound realization that I had been seen, valued, and protected in ways I'd never imagined. I didn't tell anyone. Not my coworkers, not my friends, not my family. I let Rebecca enjoy her inheritance, let my mother fuss over the house renovations, let my aunt comment on how well things had worked out. I attended family gatherings when I felt obligated, smiled when Rebecca showed off new furniture, and said nothing when conversations turned to how I'd been taken care of in my father's will through his love and memories. The silence felt different now. Before, it had been the silence of exclusion, of being forgotten. Now it was the silence of choice, of power held in reserve. I was learning what my father had tried to teach me, that the most significant inheritances are often the ones no one sees coming. 6 months passed. I used some of the trust income to move to a better apartment, one with actual sunlight and a small balcony where I could grow herbs. I bought books I'd always wanted to read, took a pottery class, traveled to places I'd only seen in photographs. But I did it all quietly, incrementally, in ways that wouldn't draw attention or questions. At work, Margaret offered me a promotion that would have meant longer hours and more responsibility. For the first time in my adult life, I had the luxury of choice. I could take the promotion because I wanted the challenge, not because I desperately needed the salary increase. I could negotiate terms, set boundaries, demand respect. The knowledge of my financial security gave me a confidence I'd never possessed before. "You're different lately," Margaret observed during one of our weekly meetings. "More decisive, more present." She was right, though I couldn't explain why without revealing the truth I was still protecting. I was more present because I no longer felt like I was constantly fighting for survival, for recognition, for basic respect. I had something that couldn't be taken away, couldn't be compared to Rebecca's achievements, couldn't be diminished by my family's opinions. I started volunteering at a local literacy center, working with adults who were learning to read. There was something powerful about being in a room full of people who understood what it felt like to be overlooked, to have your capabilities underestimated. I found purpose in their small victories, in watching confidence grow in eyes that had learned to expect disappointment. One evening, as I was helping a woman named Rosa sound out words in a children's book she wanted to read to her granddaughter, my phone rang. Rebecca's name flashed on the screen. I almost didn't answer. We rarely spoke unless there was a family obligation to coordinate. "Sarah?" Her voice was strained, higher than usual. "Are you sitting down?" "What's wrong?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. "There's been a mistake with Dad's estate. The lawyer, James Peterson. He called me today. Apparently there are things he didn't know about. Assets Dad had that weren't part of the will we heard." I said nothing, letting the silence stretch until she filled it. "Sarah, there's a trust, a big one, and your name is on it." "Oh," I said simply. "Oh, that's all you have to say?" "Sarah, this is serious. There are properties, investments. The lawyer says it's worth more than everything I inherited combined. Why didn't you tell us?" I could hear the confusion in her voice, the bewilderment of someone whose understanding of the world had just shifted dramatically. For 6 months, she had been the successful sister who had inherited everything while I got nothing. Now she was discovering that the narrative she'd constructed wasn't complete, because it wasn't yours to know, I said gently. "But we're family. We should have... I mean, if you had this money all along, why didn't you say anything? Why did you let us think you'd been left out?" "Because I was left out. Of the will you all knew about. This was separate. But why? Why would Dad do this? Why would he hide this from us?" I thought about my father's letter, about his words regarding strength that doesn't need recognition to thrive. Maybe he wanted to see how everyone would treat me when they thought I had nothing. The silence on her end was heavy. I could almost hear her replaying the past 6 months, remembering conversations where my exclusion from the inheritance had been discussed, justified, accepted as natural. "Sarah, we need to talk. As a family. Mom needs to know about this." "No," I said quietly. "We don't need to do anything. This doesn't change what already happened. But it changes everything," We didn't know. If we had known. If you had known, you would have treated me differently. That's exactly the point. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet apartment, looking out at the city lights and thinking about the strange mathematics of family love. How quickly it could be recalculated when circumstances changed. How conditional it had always been. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly. My mother, my aunt, my cousin Daniel, who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Everyone suddenly wanted to reconnect, to explain, to make sure I understood that they'd always cared about me. I let the calls go to voicemail. I listened to the messages once, then deleted them. My mother's voice was the most desperate. "Sarah, honey, please call me. Beck, I don't understand what's happening. Rebecca says there's money we didn't know about. I never meant for you to feel left out. You're my daughter too. Please, we need to talk about this as a family." But we weren't talking as a family when they thought I had nothing. We were talking now because they'd discovered I had something they hadn't accounted for. I took a week off work and drove to the coast, to a small hotel where I could hear the ocean and think clearly. I walked on the beach every morning, collecting shells and thinking about my father's final lesson. He had given me something more valuable than money. He had shown me who people really were when they thought I couldn't offer them anything in return. When I returned to the city, there was a bouquet of flowers outside my apartment door, and the card was signed by Rebecca. "We love you no matter what. Please come home for dinner Sunday. We need to fix this." But there was nothing to fix. There was no mistake to correct, no misunderstanding to clear up. They had shown me exactly how they felt about me when they thought I was powerless, and no amount of retroactive kindness could erase that knowledge. I did attend Sunday dinner, but not to reconcile. I went to observe, to see how they would handle this new information about my circumstances. My mother fussed over me like I was returning from a war. Rebecca kept glancing at me as if I might disappear if she looked away too long. My aunt asked careful questions about my situation, as if my inheritance was a medical condition that required delicate handling. "We're so happy for you," my mother said over dessert. "Your father always was full of surprises. Are you?" I asked. "Happy for me? Of course. You're our daughter. We want what's best for you. Even when you thought I had nothing." The table went quiet. Rebecca looked down at her plate. My mother's smile faltered. "Sarah," my aunt said carefully, "we never thought you had nothing. We thought you were doing fine on your own. Fine enough that you didn't question why I wasn't mentioned in Dad's will. We thought," my mother began, then stopped. "We thought he'd made his decision based on what he thought was fair. And you agreed with that decision?" Another silence. This one stretched longer, filled with the weight of admissions no one wanted to make. "We should have questioned it," Rebecca said finally. "We should have asked why. I should have asked why. But you didn't. No, we didn't." I looked around, the table at these people who shared my blood, my history, my earliest memories. I felt a strange combination of sadness and relief. Sadness for the family we might have been, relief for the clarity of seeing who we actually were. "I forgive you," I said, and meant it. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean pretending that the past 6 months didn't reveal something true about how you see me. I stood up from the table, kissed my mother's cheek, hugged Rebecca briefly, and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" my mother called after me. "Home," I said. "To my life." Over the following months, they tried various approaches to reconnect. Invitations to family events, casual calls to check in, Christmas gifts that were clearly expensive, as if they could purchase their way back into my good graces. I was polite but distant. I attended major holidays but declined smaller gatherings. I answered their calls, but kept conversations brief. I had learned something valuable about the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I refused to trade my hard-won peace for the comfort of familiar dysfunction. I used my inheritance wisely, just as my father had hoped. I invested in the literacy center where I volunteered, helping them expand their programs. I bought a small house with a garden where I could grow vegetables and herbs. I traveled to places I'd dreamed of seeing, not to escape my life, but to enrich it. And I wrote. I had always kept journals, but now I began writing stories about overlooked people, quiet heroes, the power of being underestimated. My first short story was published in a literary magazine 6 months later. It was about a woman who inherited her father's garden and discovered that the most beautiful flowers grew in the corners where no one thought to look. Rebecca called when she saw the story online. "I read your piece," she said. "It's beautiful. Is it about us?" "It's about gardens," I replied. "Sarah, I want you to know that I think about what happened. I think about it a lot." "I know." "Do you think we'll ever be close again, like real sisters?" I considered the question seriously. I think we're exactly as close as we're meant to be. A year after the truth about my inheritance emerged, I received a letter from my father's first attorney, James Peterson. He wanted to know if I would consider serving on the board of a foundation, being established in my father's name. Apparently, before his death, my father had discussed creating a scholarship fund for students who showed promise, but lacked family support. He specifically mentioned that he wanted someone who understood what it felt like to be overlooked to help identify deserving candidates, Peterson wrote. I accepted the position. At the first board meeting, I met other people who had been quietly building lives of meaning, while others received the recognition. There was a professor who had been passed over for promotions, while her male colleagues advanced. A social worker who had spent decades helping children no one else wanted to save. An artist whose work was finally being recognized after years of creating in obscurity. We understood each other in ways my family never could. We knew that the most valuable inheritances aren't always announced with fanfare. Sometimes they're passed down in whispered conversations, in the example of quiet dignity, in the knowledge that being overlooked doesn't mean being worthless. As I sit now in my garden, watching tomatoes ripen on vines I planted myself, I think about the strange journey that brought me here. My family still doesn't fully understand what happened between us. They see my financial independence and my peaceful life and assume that time has healed whatever wounds they inflicted. But healing doesn't mean returning to what was broken. Sometimes it means growing something entirely new from the pieces that remain. Last week, Rebecca called to tell me she's getting married. She asked if I would be her maid of honor. I told her I would attend the wedding and be happy for her, but that I thought she should choose someone who had been present for her journey, someone who knew her heart. "I want you there," she insisted. "You're my sister." "I am," I agreed. "And I'll be there. But as your sister, not as your maid of honor. There's a difference." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm starting to understand that there are a lot of differences I never noticed before." "Yes," I said, "there are. My father taught me that inheritance isn't just about money or property. It's about the lessons we carry forward, the strength we develop when no one is watching, the wisdom that comes from being underestimated and choosing to thrive anyway. I inherited more than they ever gave my sister. I inherited the knowledge of who I am when I have nothing to prove, nowhere to perform, no one to impress. I inherited the peace that comes from building a life based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. And perhaps most importantly, I inherited the understanding that sometimes the greatest gift is being overlooked by people who never deserved to see you clearly in the first place. They gave my inheritance to my sister, but they never had the power to give away what truly belonged to me.